Hello there. So this article is out of box. 5 things people get wrong about slavery. And so you see people here, they're in a museum. A lot of people are in search of their past, or they're in search of what happened in the past, particularly having to do with slavery and the history of it. So we've asked historians to debunk slavery's greatest myths. And so what are 5 things that people get wrong about slavery? And so in August of 1619, the first slave ship with 20 and odd enslaved Africans arrived on the shores of Virginia. And so 400 years later, we look back at this moment, and as the start of the enduring relationship between the founding um, of the United States and the unconscionable exploitation of the enslaved in a sweeping project published in the New York Times Magazine this month, exploring the legacy of slavery by Nicole Hannah Jones, wrote that the enslaved and their descendants transformed the lands to which they had been brought. Okay, and so it goes on to say that into some of the most successful colonies in the British Empire. But it would be historically inaccurate to reduce the contributions of black people in the vast material wealth created by our bondage. So black Americans have also been and continue to be foundational to the idea of American freedom. So yet centuries later, the lasting impact of slavery continues to be minimized, and myths continue to flourish. For instance, there's the erasure of many slave revolts and rebellions that happened throughout the nation, perpetuating the lie that enslaved peoples were docile or they were satisfied with their conditions. As we did hear, like there was a newscaster, or he was Bill O'Reilly, he said the slaves were happy with their condition, or they were well fed, in other words, as he coined it. And so there also are the persistence of the idea that black labor exploitation is over, and when mass incarceration still keeps millions of blacks and black Americans till this day behind bars, often working for wages that amount to less than $1 an hour. And so there's the idea that our understanding of slavery is accurate based on what we learn in history textbooks, when in reality misinformation continues to be taught in the public schools about slavery's legacy, or it's not taught at all. That's another thing I've noticed. Um, and so, to unpack what often gets mistold or misunderstood, we've asked 5 historians to debunk those biggest myths about slavery, and here's what they have said in their own words. Number 1, the myth of slaves never rebelled. Miseducation surrounding slavery in the U.S. has led to elaborate mythology of half-truths and missing information. So one key piece of missing information on history concerns slave revolts. Few history books or popular media portrayal of the transatlantic slave trade discuss many slaves rebellions that occurred throughout America's early history. So C.L.R. James, A History of Pan-African Revolt, describes many small rebellions such as the Stono Plantation insurgents of September 1739 in the South Carolina colony, where a small group of enslaved Africans first killed 2 guards, and others joined them as they moved toward the nearby plantation, setting them afire and killing about 2 dozen enslavers, especially violent overseers. Nat Turner's August 1831 uprising in the Southampton of Virginia, where 55 to 65 enslavers were killed and their plantations burned, serves as another example. Right here, what you see pictured, the huge trees and the road. It's the country road that follows the trial of Nat Turner 1831 slave rebellion in the rural southeastern Virginia, June 5th, 2010. On either side of the farms were burned and the slavers were murdered as Nat Turner and his followers marched toward the town of Jerusalem, now renamed Cortland. So here it is pictured here. And so enslaved Africans resisted and rebelled against individual slaveholders and the system of slavery as a whole. So some slipped away secretly to learn to read, and many simply escaped. So others joined the abolitionist movement and wrote books and gave lectures to the public about their experiences in captivity, and others led or participated in open combat against their captors. So omitting them and or minimizing these stories of rebellion helps hide the violent and traumatic experience enslaved Africans endured at the hands of enslavers, which prompted such revolts. So if we were unaware of resistance, it is easier for us to believe that enslaved were happy, docile, and that their conditions were not inhumane. So it then becomes easier to dismiss economic and epigenetic legacies of the transatlantic slave system. And so Dale Alexander is an associate professor at California State University, Sacramento. Number 2's myth is that the house slaves had it better than the field slaves. And so while physical labor in the fields was excruciating for enslaved peoples, clearing land, planting, harvesting, and that often destroyed their bodies, that didn't negate from the physical and emotional violence enslaved women and sometimes men and children suffered at the hands of enslavers in the house. And so, in fact, rape of black women by white enslavers was so prevalent that in 2016 study revealed 16.7% of African Americans' ancestors can be traced back to Europe. And so one of the study's authors concludes that the first African Americans to leave the South were those genetically related to the men who raped their mothers, grandmothers, and or great-grandmothers as well. So these were enslaved African Americans within the closest proximity to whom spent the longest durations with white men, those of whom who toiled in the house of slave owners. And so here's a woman pictured here who is of mixed race because of being in a situation. An unidentified woman poses with a book in her hands, circa 1850. Original caption identifies her as a freed slave. And so a 2015 study determined that 50% of the rape survivors develop PTSD. It is hard to imagine that enslaved and freedom-seeking African American survivors of rape, female, male, old, young, no matter what their physical and mental abilities, did not experience further anxiety, fear, shame associated with the condition that they could not control in a situation out of control. So those African Americans with most European ancestry, those tormented mentally, physically, emotionally, and genetically, in the house knew that they had to get out. So in fact, they fled the farthest. Southern whites are more closely related to blacks now living in the North and the South than in the South. Okay, so Jansen Allen is a public historian and dialogue facilitator working at nonprofits, hospitals, and businesses in New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. So number 3, the myth that abolition was the end of racism. So a common myth that's perpetuated in the American slavery is that when it ended, white supremacy and racism in the Americas also ended. So recently, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell offered a familiar variant of this myth when he said that he opposed reparations for something that happened 150 years ago. So to the Kentucky Republican, a descendant of enslavers, slavery simply was, and then is, it just wasn't, as though the battlefield had been leveled by the playing field when it came to race. But the truth is that long after Civil War, white Americans continued to carry the same set of white supremacist beliefs that governed their thoughts and actions during slavery and into the post-emancipation era. So in the South especially, whites retained an enslaver mentality. So they embraced sharecropping, convict leasing, and to control black labor in the late 19th century enacted Jim Crow laws to regulate black behavior in the early 20th century and used racial terror to police the color line to this day. And so here you see these men colored only. These are signs of the Jim Crow era. It is undated photo of two men use segregated drinking fountains in the American South. And this is what was going on even after so-called slavery was supposed to be abolished or ended. So in the North, whites also rejected racial equality after emancipation. They refused to make abandoned and confiscated land available to freedmen because they believed that African Americans would not work without white supervision. And when African Americans began fleeing Dixie during the Great Migration, white Northerners instituted their own brand of Jim Crow segregation and segregating neighborhoods and refusing to hire black workers on a non-discriminatory basis. So slavery's legacy is white supremacy. The ideology, which rationalized bondage for 250 years, has justified the discriminatory treatment of African Americans for 150 years since the war had ended. So the belief that black people are less than white people has made segregated schools acceptable, mass incarceration possible, and police violence permissible. And so this makes the myth that slavery had no lasting impact extremely consequential. Denying the persistence and the existence of white supremacy obscures the root cause of the problems that continue to plague African Americans till this day. As a result, policy, and I'm adding that in there, it happens to this day. So as a result, policymakers fixate on fixing black people instead of trying to undo discriminatory systems and structures that have resulted in separate and unequal education, voter suppression, health disparities, and wealth gap as well. So something did happen 150 years ago. Slavery ended. But the institution's influence on American racism and its continued impact on African Americans is still felt to this day. So Hassan Kwame Jeffries is an associate professor of Ohio State University. The fourth myth is that the history class taught us everything we need to know about slavery. And there's some classrooms that don't even talk about it. So I'm adding that in there myself. Many of us first learned about slavery in middle school, high school history classes, but some of us learned much earlier in elementary school through children's books or even Black History Month curriculum and programs. So unfortunately, we don't always learn the entire story, which is still perpetuated this day. We don't learn the entire story, or if any story is at all. Most of us only learn partial truths about slavery in the U.S., or the United States as it's called. After the Civil War and Reconstruction period, many of the North and South wanted to put an end to the continuing tensions, but this wasn't done through the Compromise of 1877 when the federal government pulled the last troops out of the South. It was also done by suppressing the rights of Black Americans and elevating the so-called lost culture of the enslavers. And so you see here what we much see today in a lot of these protests of people that are involved in these hate groups. And so the Tennessee-based group, New Confederate State of America, held a protest in support of retaining a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee located at the Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, September 16th of 2017. Okay? Okay, and so the Lost Cause is a distorted version of Civil War history. In the decades after the war, a number of Southern historians began to write that slaveholders were noble and had the right to secede from the Union when the North wished to interfere with their way of life due to the efforts by a group of Southern socialites known as the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Lost Cause ideology influenced history textbooks as well as books for children and adults. So accomplishments of Black Americans involved in abolition movements such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Maria W. Stewart, Henry Highland Garnet and William Still were downplayed. And so Union generals like Ulysses S. Grant were denigrated, as were anti-racist whites from John Brown to William Lloyd Garrison. Generations later, there are still many people around the country who believe the Civil War was about states' rights and that the slaves who had good masters were treated well. And so even an accurate historical curriculum emphasizes our progress, triumph, optimism for the country as well as a whole, without taking into consideration how slavery continues to affect Black Americans and influence present-day domestic policy for urban planning to health care. So it does not emphasize the 12 of the first 18 presidents that were enslavers, and that enslaved Africans from particular cultures were prized for their skills, and from rice cultivation to metallurgy, and that the enslaved people used every tool at their disposal to resist the bondage and seek freedom. So from slavery to Jim Crow, the rights to the first Black president, and the Black American story is forced into the story of the unassailable American dream. And so even when the truth is more complicated, given what we learn about slavery, when we learn it, and how it is clear that everyone still has much more to learn, teaching tolerance and teaching for the change are the two organizations that have been wrestling with how to introduce the topic to the young people, youth, on the subjects of slavery. And what they're learning is the way forward is to unlearn. And so Ebony Elizabeth Thomas is an associate professor at University of Pennsylvania. The fifth myth, the myth is that slavery doesn't exist today. One of the greatest myths today about slavery is it has ended. In fact, it has evolved to this day into a modern form of mass incarceration. So the United States has the highest prison population in the world. More than 2.2 million Americans are incarcerated. 4.5 million are on probation or parole, and African Americans make up 13% of the general population, but Black men, women, and youth have outsized representation in the criminal justice system, where they make up 34% of the 6.8 million people who are under its control. So their labor is used to produce goods and services for businesses that are profit for prison labor. And so here you go, right here. You're seeing it. Looks like the same picture as slavers, but these are prisoners out on the cotton field picking cotton. And so prisoners at the Ferguson Unit, a large prison among the Trinity River in Texas, actively work on a farm prison run, which includes planting and harvesting annual cotton crops. In 1997, this was going on. Probably still stuff happening. But it may be in other forms, but it's still going on with the prison labor. The prison is located on a former cotton slave plantation, as a matter of fact. So this picture looks very familiar at what happened before, which has happened a lot recent in the same way. So for thousands, or for many people. So for those of us who study the early history of mass incarceration in America, the statistics are not surprising. From late 1860s through the 1920s, over 90% of the prison population, jail population of the South were Black. So thousands of incarcerated men and women and children were hired out by the state to private factories and farms for a fee. And so from sunup to sundown, they worked under the watchful eye of brutal whipping bosses who flogged, mauled, and murdered them. And they earned nothing to their toil. So today, labor exploitation, the denial of human dignity, and the right to citizenship, family separation, violent punishment define our criminal justice system in ways that mirror slavery. So hundreds of thousands of incarcerated people work According to the 2017 report published by the Prison Policy Initiative, the average minimum daily wage paid to incarcerated workers non-industry prison jobs is now 86 cents on the dollar. And so those assigned to work for state-owned businesses, correctional industries, earn 33 cents on the dollar, which is $1.41 per hour. In 2018, incarcerated Americans held a nationwide strike to end the prison slavery. And so in a list, demands striking individuals called for all persons in prison in any place of detention under the United States jurisdiction to be paid the prevailing wage in their state or territory for their labor. So this is a year to remember slavery's origin. It is also an opportunity to critique its legacies. And let's not forget, and let's not get so caught up in our efforts to commemorate slavery's beginning that we fail to advocate for its end. And so that's pretty much this article. It's an earlier version that's misstated is the range of presidents who were enslavers, and it was 12 of the first 18 presidents, not 12 of the 16th, the first 16. And so this picture looks very familiar, doesn't it? But this actually was in the early 90s, which is scary. And so you think this was a long time ago, and it did happen a long time ago, and it still was happening. So let me reiterate, this picture here is a picture of a prisoner, and he is picking cotton. And he's a prisoner at Ferguson Unit, a large prison along the Trinity River in Texas, actively working on a farm prison that is run, which includes planting, harvesting, and annual cotton crops. This was in 1997 when this picture was taken, and this is what it looks like. It looks much like what we see when we see those slave pictures of where it looks like this. And they weren't prisoners, they were enslaved people, but this isn't much different, is it? So that's just to give you a clue of what's going on. And what's happening right now, what we see a lot of is protests and a lot of groups cropping up all over the place with their ideologies, and we're seeing a lot of mass shootings that go behind it with the same ideologies. Even though they say they're isolated incidences or they're individuals, but they write up scathing manifestos as to why they believe in certain particular beliefs. And to pretty much hit to home on these issues that we still are experiencing the same types of issues. You see the sign here, this was during the Jim Crow South. Well, not much difference. You got today doubling down on racist comments, a council candidate who says she opposes interracial marriage. So you still have people that hold to the same beliefs even till this day, that people should stay in their own groups. Marysville City Council candidate Jean Kramer said that she doesn't have any plans to back out of the race despite coming under fire for racist comments she made about an election form on Thursday night. She made in an election form. So she gave her personal opinion how she feels on race relations and dating, interracial dating, which she's entitled to. But the thing is, it's not a good look for what she's trying to run for. Mayor Dan and other local leaders, however, have called for her withdrawal because of the statement she made, which include, I would say that I probably came to the conclusion this morning, he said, Friday, after the initial shock of what she said really sank in, and given the deep-seated viewpoints that she has, I don't believe that she's fit to serve as an elected official in Marysville or any other place or anywhere else. So Kramer, one of the 5 residents vying for 3 council seats in November election coming up, responded to a question at the city candidates forum about attracting foreign-born residents to the community. Keep Marysville a white community as much as possible. So these were this woman's statements right here. She's running for a council seat. 3 council seats, that is what it said, I believe. And so After the forum, she expanded on her beliefs, particularly about the people of different races that they shouldn't be married. And so during a follow-up interview outside her Marysville home Friday afternoon, Kramer doubled down on her statements and asked if she understood why that might upset her neighbors. And she said, if there were a biracial marriage in the family, yes. And so, so during that interview outside of her home, she expressed that. So anyway, because of people that don't on the other side of it, she says, whatever reason I heard they love each other, whatever, but there's also such thing as remaining single. So people don't necessarily have to get married, and if they love somebody or love them, or love them single. So there's nothing wrong with that. So Kramer, 67 years of age, has cited the Bible in backing up her ideology about people of color should stay with people of color and white people should stay with people who are white. And this was in her Bible ideology. Despite the widespread condemnation of her views, she said that she doesn't believe that she was racist. And so there's a lot of people like her that believe those same thoughts. I'm adding that in there. So as far as I know, as long as we have been here, Marysville has been a white community, a white city, she said. And if we have seen black persons here or there or whatever, we're not bothered by it, but I'm not bothered by it. And so Kevin Watkins, president of the Port Hearn chapter of the NAACP, said that he also thought it was inappropriate for Kramer to withdraw from Marysville City Council race. That he thinks it's appropriate that she should withdraw. So, because of her statements, but he added it was important that the initial call came from the city's own leaders. So Watkins said that the local minority community was always aware that racism existed in the area and as in other communities. So he said that he believed individuals like Kramer are more recently emboldened to come forward, taking a play out of Trump's playbook. Okay, and so the good news is now that we can see, and you and we hear how you feel. He said, I know in my heart that she's in the minority. Okay, so both Watkins and Damman have said that the local controversy has arisen from Kramer's comments will ultimately spur more constructive conversation for the local residents. So Damman said that he wants to ensure that everyone is heard. So it just tells us that as far as we have come as a society, there's still a very disappointing, closed-minded, oppressive viewpoint out there. And the mayor has said. So, and I think that we have to have conversations that make all areas a better place for people of all races, nationalities, and origins. So that's pretty much that article. I just thought it was fitting for this article that I had first read because of what is going on, in so much of what we see in the news. And so, with that being said, I'm going to leave this article and some things. What do you think? 5 things that people still get wrong about slavery and the myths. I feel now my opinion is that, like someone once put it so greatly, that they would tell these stories about Rosa Parks in the schools and make it sound like she was this little old black lady who had tired feet and she was so exhausted and she just wanted to stay in her seat and she didn't want to make any trouble. And what they failed to realize is it wasn't just this tired old lady. She was very outspoken. She was very vocal about politics in terms of race relations and what went on. She was a great orator, speaker, and she was not this little old tired old lady that didn't have any strength. She actually protested that she wasn't going to get out of her seat, that they had to arrest her and she wasn't going to be moved. So she showed a lot of more force. She wasn't this little tired, frail old lady that had tired feet. And so I feel like the reason why they tell that story in school is because they want to make it seem as though we can accept this story, but we can't accept a black woman who's strong and who speaks out on issues of politics and that stands up for herself, because that's seen as a threat. Because they already have the viewpoint out there that black women that are vocal, that speak out on issues of politics, that stand up for themselves, they're loud, they're criminalistic, or they're not even seen as human, or worse, and that they're making their troublemakers. And so that's the thing I wanted to reiterate on these issues, as you know, to add to it. And to if you see these pictures here, they were supposed to do a $20 bill with Harriet Tubman, you see in the background. That didn't take place. And so there's been all kinds of stories about, oh, we couldn't do this and this, that, and the other. And so you don't see very much talk about that. And they pretty much put that on the back burner, and they're claiming that won't go down until the year of, I think, 2023, maybe a later years, and which almost seems like they want that to die out and not even happen. And so it's just like the reparations talk. And so it's easy to sweep everything under the rug and make it seem like that history, or that part of American history, is non-existent and over with, because Mitch McConnell made the comment that we had a black president, and that's what sealed the deal. We don't have to worry about the race relation issue anymore, when we have all to worry about it, because it's happening in real time. We see this going on with the shootings and with the people getting killed. You can't go in a store, if you look a certain way, somebody might come in and blow your head off because you happen to not be white. And so we've seen this, we've heard it, and we know that's what's going on. So what are your thoughts and feedback on this? I'm going to let this video go, let it marinate, and that's pretty much it on this issue. And then we see today we have other would-be politicians mimicking the same views as the Trump administration on how they feel about race relations. And so with that being said, like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for listening.